The videos are up on my channel and the reviews have been filled out and published. The 70RL 2025 competition is done. And luckily I won't be doing any more of these reviews until September, when Rogue Temple's Fortnite basically takes place. September 1st to September 15th here. But that will basically be like, several months from now, so we won't worry about it. And it sucks for us to close out this video and the 70-year-olds of this year. So first things first, before I basically get into anything else, I'll note that basically I did 107 reviews basically for this year. Broke triple digits, hooray. Big milestone for me. But it also really begs the question of how much impact I'm basically having on the reviews myself. And I believe anyone should be doing this, definitely me for sure, but if you have the time to actually be a juror in 2026, please do so. In total, basically, I did 36.15% of all the reviews basically done this year. And you look at this and the next 3, 4, maybe even 5 people only match up the amount of reviews I basically did, which is not great. It means I basically have a huge impact on all the scoring, and some scores may be adjusted higher or lower, based on my wins more than anything else. So I highly recommend it, and I'm sure everyone else does, that if you can be a juror, come and do 5 games or so. You don't have to do many. Some people down here, they barely have any reviews, but even if you just do 5 games or 10 games, that's a big help. So you don't have to do many, just come help out a little bit to help the juror process and help get this percentage down, because it really shouldn't be this high for me, for sure. All right, with that out of the way, I'll basically note that basically my playlist here is basically up on my YouTube channel. I have all the successful games I reviewed, all the games that I reviewed right after, and of course all the failed digs that I reviewed right after that. And for the most part, I mainly played all the games again this year because I did some reviews. I wasn't actually intending to actually do all the reviews again this year, but when you basically have over half of them review of the main games, everything else just seemed it's not going to take that long. 13 days ago, I was basically done with my last review, and then between 12 days and now, I basically did all the deprioritized games, the other games I didn't get to, and then all the failed digs right after that, right? So it really didn't take that much time. But I'll note that basically in 2026 and onward, I'm not really intending basically to review everything I have been these years, but it is what it is. I did it all because why not? Also, Kizrachi wasn't doing any his streaming, and I wasn't sure if anyone else was basically doing it, so at least there's now a video record of all these games, so at least there's that. Now, speaking about the games here, it's worth mentioning that I felt that some of the games here that were basically uploaded this year were a little bit poorer than last year. And what I mean by being poor is the fact that there was basically your mix of games that basically weren't roguelikes, but there's also quite a few games that it's sort of lack the scope for being a 70-year-old. I'm basically looking at the games right here: RailRL, Ravel Key, Ruins of the Lost, Jump 70RL 25, Quantum Rogue, Venture, Drift Run Rogue-lite. These games right here, all the deprioritized ones that I basically got to right away. And these games right here, I mean, yes, RailRL you could say is basically been deprioritized for not being a roguelike. Ravel Key you could say is basically deprioritized for not being a roguelike, but you could also equally say it's basically deprioritized for not having a scope for one. I forget what Ruins of the Lost basically is here, but let's just have a quick look to see what it is. Most I'll give a few comments on it. Yeah, this is basically Ruins of the Lost here. You can basically say that this is basically another instance where it's not a roguelike, but in my opinion, this is not so much a case of not being roguelike because it's an action roguelike, but it's more of an issue that there's just not enough scope basically to these games. And I found this to be a big issue for a lot of the games I basically reviewed. A lot of my scoring basically this year you know, a scope was for like, you know, to twos was basically like, you know, the same as like last year, but a lot of games I was basically giving like a lot of ones, and a lot of games like, you know, didn't get the freeze that they did like, you know, in the years prior. I mean, there's also like a lot of issues with like, you know, roguelikeness where like, you know, there was maybe like, you know, freeze given up on me and not as many twos and a lot of like ones, but I felt like, you know, for a lot of this like, you know, this year, there's a big problem with like the amount of like, you know, a lack of scope basically. And, you know, I'm not sure if basically it's just a one-off year because like, you know, Trump being in office and like other stuff happening in the world, but it's worth pointing out. All right, so that's basically all like the, you know, comments I basically have on the games and stuff like that. Now, one thing I just want to sort of close out with like, you know, this year, someone basically mentioned that basically like, you know, they were like wondering about like, you know, the idea of like, you know, complexity and like roguelikes. So I'll note that basically I have like, you know, my roguelike just like judging chart right here, and you'll actually see I actually have complexity as like one of the qualifiers I basically have for a game. And someone's basically mentioning about how like, you know, we shouldn't be judging like, you know, roguelikes based on how complex they are, because like that's basically sort of like tying in a scope. And my opinion basically of this is that like, you know, that's not really a good reason. Like the thing about scope is basically how much work is basically in the game. So you might like say like, you know, for scope, how like, you know, how much like, you know, enemies are basically in there, how many like, you know, levels are basically like, you know, you're like, you know, different biomes and like stuff like that you're basically going through. Is there a boss level basically go through? Is there like, you know, dialogue and stuff like that? That's what I basically consider to be like scope. Complexity basically is something very different. Complexity basically it's like the idea of like, you know, how many actions can your character basically take? Can like you know, can like drink a potion? Can like use a potion? Can basically like, you know, wheel a potion? What can you basically do with that potion, for example? That's the idea of like, you know, complexity right there. Like, you know, how many actions did you basically code to like, you know, like, you know, an item can basically be used to perform. And you might also have like, you know, complexity in the idea of like, you know, piss and vinegar, for example, from like, you know, last year. Piss and vinegar basically had you like, you know, how many actions you basically do to like the punctuate guy, right? So that's why I basically see as like complexity. You might not like, you know, see a whole lot of like, you know, work being like done with like, say like, you know, some game like piss and vinegar, but it basically has a lot of complexity is the idea. So that's where like, you know, you basically get the complexity like, you know, sort of modifier basically from. So I don't really just agree that basically complexity should be judged differently from like, you know, scope. But at the same time, it is something I think that it should be like different, because scope is basically like, you know, how much work do you put into the project, whereas complexity is basically like, you know, how much like, you know, actions can be like done, you know, by the character. Because like, you know, is there multiple solutions to a goal? Like, you know, can I basically like kill a monster by like, you know, hacking and slash him? Sure. But is there other ideas, like say, can I like throw a potion up to like, you know, make him disappear and like, you know, teleport somewhere? Can I like, you know, set him on fire? Can I polymorph him? Can I push him off a ledge? Like just these like, you know, this is the thing about what makes complexity different from like, you know, scope. So you need to have that more than anything else. That's basically a bit of a rant on my part, I guess, but you know, that's basically how I sort of judge it. And yes, basically this is, I'm still you know, using it for judging this like, you know, sort of like qualifying sheet right here. I'm look basically, you know, the key things basically look for like procedural generation, permanent F, complexity, first and foremost for most games. And then if it has that, basically like, you know, what else does it have? Like, you know, is it closely related to our genre? So one game that we basically had this year was basically more of like, you know, a Heroes Magic game, for example. So I don't really consider that to be in the same genre as like Rogue, for example. So you probably lose points for that. Secondary judging, limited party size. That's like another reason that like it would probably limit it. Twin reaction, analytical thinking. Like, you know, if it's like if it's an action role, like basically am I thinking or am I like, you know, just sort of reacting to stuff is the idea, right? So I don't think I need to explain a lot of this stuff. It's basically like, you know, a lot of like, you know, the feel like how rogues basically are as opposed to like, you know, anything else. All right, so there hasn't been a whole lot of like, you know, mentions like, you know, what games basically people should actually use or like, you know, play for this game for like, you know, this year. If you basically need to like, you know, have like a list of games to sort of look out for, go to like, you know, the 70-year-old 25 Rogue Spotlight post that I basically have here, and like the 70-year-old Spotlight thread in like the Rogue group here for Steam group. I also made like, you know, a duplicate sort of like, you know, posting basically like, you know, Reddit. So this will probably like, you know, be buried at some point, but you know, I posted down here like a list of like, you know, games that you want to check out. If you need like, you know, a short list of like games to sort of like, you know, browse and stuff like that. I won't go into detail about like why basically you want to check like any of these games. I try to make a good mix of them, but I'll leave it to you really to sort of like find your own games if you basically want to like delve into them further. But these are what I consider like the highlights for like this year. All right, so now that's basically all the way. There's one more thing to sort of note. I'll note that basically when I was looking at this like that list right there, and I'll bring this up briefly. So I want to note that one of these games right here, Archipelago of Monsters. This is sort of to tell you a little bit of story about like something I hope that could be like improved by like next year. I'll note that basically I was the first one to basically review this game here, and I basically reviewed it like a month ago basically for like all intents and purposes. If I was to go into like the actual like date, it's like literally like April 21st of like this year here. And I'll note that basically this is like over a month after like when this like game was basically like submitted to like the 70-year-old jam. Something I think that needs to be really improved for like next year is the idea of like people holding on to like games to review, because this game basically didn't get reviewed for like over a month and a half because 2 other people are basically holding the game in their like their review like portfolios, and those games weren't being taken from those like reviewers and given to someone else. And this is I'll note that basically I'm not like not guilty of this myself. There's like one time I basically had like a game for like over 2 weeks, but you definitely want to, I think Darren's definitely got to sort of like work really hard to sort of like be like, say like after 3 weeks, hey, are you going to basically review these, or should I take away and like give it to someone else or sign them? Because I don't think this is like a good idea, because this is basically the top rated game here, just like one right here, which is why I'm basically like noting it. And there's actually another game that's also like at the time I was basically like recording this or like reviewing this game here. There's also another game that didn't have any reviews as well, and several other games had only one review. So it definitely needs to be improved on for like next year, basically like people basically holding on to reviews and stuff like that. All right, there's not much more to basically say about this year, but even though like a lot of the games I basically like played were like a little bit subpar, I did enjoy playing them. And as you basically saw from that list there, I had like several games that basically could like walk away with and say like these are worth like checking out. I won't say they're necessarily perfect, even the games I basically listed right there, but they did a fairly good job for like 7 days, the developers, and I think they should be like applauded for their efforts. We'll see what happens in 2026, but for now, well, I guess we'll be like waiting until Rogue-lite Fortnite's basically like games are put out. And until then, just take care.